The morning of March 17, 1945, somewhere in the Hürtgen forest along the German-Belgian border, a Wehrmacht observation post reported something impossible to their battalion headquarters. An entire German patrol, 11 men, had been eliminated over the course of 42 minutes. Each man shot once, each shot fatal. No muzzle flash observed, no position identified. The spotter who filed the report added a detail that his commanding officer initially dismissed as combat stress. Request immediate relief. Sniper is invisible. Cannot determine range or location despite clear sight lines. The invisible sniper was Corporal Kenneth Morrison, 28th Infantry Division, and he wasn't actually invisible. He was lying 68 yards from the nearest German position, in plain sight, wearing camouflage that violated every regulation in the U.S. Army Field Manual. What made him invisible wasn't some exotic technology or special training. It was mud. Specifically, a mixture of forest soil, rotting vegetation, animal dung, and his own urine, applied in layers over 72 hours, until his entire body became indistinguishable from the forest floor he was lying on. Morrison had learned this technique not from any military instructor, but from a Choctaw trapper in rural Oklahoma who'd taught him that the best way to disappear wasn't to hide behind something, but to become something the eye wouldn't recognize as human. By the time Morrison was killed by artillery fire on June 4, 1945, 3 months after that morning in the Hürtgen forest, he had 309 confirmed kills. Every single one achieved using camouflage methods that were explicitly prohibited in Army Field Manual 21-75, the official doctrine for scouting, patrolling, and sniping. The manual specified approved camouflage patterns, approved materials, and approved application methods. Morrison ignored all of it. And in doing so, he became the most effective American sniper of the European theater, a record that would stand until Vietnam. This is the story of how organic camouflage, the kind that smelled like death and horrified officers who encountered it, gave one soldier an advantage that no amount of official training could replicate, and how the Army, faced with undeniable results, had to confront the fact that sometimes the rule book is written by people who've never had to be invisible while someone's actively trying to kill them. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Kenneth Morrison grew up in Broken Bow, Oklahoma, population 873, where his family had lived since his great-grandfather had walked the Trail of Tears in 1838. His mother was full-blooded Choctaw. His father was Irish-American, a timber surveyor who'd married into the tribe and learned to move through forests with the kind of silence that comes from understanding that trees have patterns, and breaking those patterns gets you noticed. Morrison learned to hunt from Joseph Hawkins, his mother's uncle, who still practiced traditional hunting methods that hadn't changed much in 200 years. Hawkins didn't use modern hunting blinds or store-bought camouflage. He used mud, plants, and an understanding of how predators see that was based on generations of accumulated knowledge about what the human eye actually registers versus what it dismisses as background. The principle was simple, but required patience that most modern hunters didn't have. You didn't wear a pattern that looked like the forest. You covered yourself in actual forest material until you literally became part of the environment. Hawkins would spend hours before a hunt collecting soil, leaves, bark fragments, and moss from the specific area where he planned to position himself. He'd mix it with water or sometimes his own saliva to create a paste, then apply it in irregular patterns to his skin and clothing. The goal wasn't to create a camouflage pattern. It was to break up the human silhouette so completely that the brain's pattern recognition simply skipped over you. Morrison spent hundreds of hours with Hawkins between the ages of 12 and 18, learning techniques that weren't written down anywhere because they were passed orally from hunter to hunter. How to move 1 inch per minute through brush without creating motion that draws the eye. How to position yourself so the sun never backlights your outline. How to control your breathing so your chest doesn't rise and fall in the regular pattern that predators recognize as prey. And most importantly, how to accept discomfort as the price of invisibility. because staying perfectly still for 6 hours while insects crawl across your face and mud dries in your ears isn't something you can train someone to tolerate. It's something you either accept or you don't. When Morrison enlisted in November 1942, 3 weeks after his 18th birthday, he listed his occupation as timber surveyor like his father. The recruitment officer in Durant, Oklahoma, looked at his height, 5 feet 7 inches, and his weight, 138 pounds, and noted that he was on the small side but acceptable for infantry. The Army sent him to Camp Roberts in California for basic training, where he scored expert marksman on his first qualification with the M1 Garand, hitting 47 out of 50 targets at ranges from 100 to 500 yards. His drill instructor, Sergeant Major Wallace Kemp, noticed something unusual about Morrison's shooting position. Most recruits, trained according to Army doctrine, fired from standard positions outlined in the field manual, standing, kneeling, sitting, or prone with the rifle supported properly. Morrison fired from positions that looked uncomfortable, sometimes contorted, but he never missed. When Kemp asked about it, Morrison's explanation was simple. I'm shooting from where I can see the target, without the target seeing me. Comfortable doesn't matter if you're dead. Kemp, who'd seen combat in World War I and understood that doctrine and reality sometimes diverged, flagged Morrison for advanced marksmanship training. By March 1943, Morrison was at Fort Benning, Georgia, in a specialized scout sniper course that was supposed to produce soldiers capable of long-range precision fire in support of infantry operations. The course was 8 weeks long. Morrison learned the official doctrine, how to estimate range using mil-dot scopes, how to adjust for wind and elevation, how to construct proper sniper hides using approved materials and approved methods. Field Manual 21-75, Section 4, Paragraph 12, was explicit about camouflage standards. Snipers will utilize camouflage materials including camouflage nets, pattern-disrupting face paint, and appropriate concealment of equipment. Natural materials may supplement but not replace equipment. Personal hygiene will be maintained to prevent disease and maintain unit effectiveness. That last sentence was important. The Army's position on camouflage was based on 2 principles. First, that mass-produced camouflage materials provided adequate concealment. Second, that soldiers needed to maintain hygiene standards to prevent disease from spreading through units. Covering yourself in mud, feces, and rotting plant matter violated both principles. It was unsanitary, potentially disease-spreading, and completely unnecessary, given that the Army had spent considerable resources developing proper camouflage equipment. Morrison understood the doctrine. He also understood that doctrine was written for soldiers who would be operating near friendly lines with regular access to supplies and support. That wasn't always reality. Sometimes you were 300 yards into German-held territory with nothing but what you carried, and the question wasn't whether your camouflage was sanitary, it was whether it worked well enough to keep you alive until extraction. He graduated from the Scout Sniper course in May 1943 and shipped out to England in August as part of the 28th Infantry Division's reconnaissance company. By December, the division was preparing for deployment to France. By February 1945, they were in Germany, fighting through the Hürtgen forest, where the trees were so dense that air support was useless and every 100 yards cost lives. The Hürtgen forest in early 1945 was where the German army came to die slowly. The forest covered roughly 50 square miles along the German-Belgian border. All of it dense pine and hardwood stands with visibility limited to 50 yards on a good day, 20 yards in the heavy growth. The 28th Infantry Division entered the forest on February 9, 1945, with orders to clear German positions and secure approach routes for the eventual Rhine crossing. German defensive doctrine in the Hürtgen was to turn the forest itself into a weapon. They'd had months to prepare positions, machine gun nests with interlocking fields of fire, mortar pits pre-registered on likely American approaches, sniper positions in trees that commanded every clearing. American casualties were running at approximately 30% for units that stayed in the forest longer than 2 weeks. The Germans had the advantage of knowing the terrain. They'd prepared it. They'd practiced movement through it. And they'd learned how to use the forest's natural concealment better than attacking American forces who were still trying to apply open-field tactics to an environment where you couldn't see past the next tree line. Morrison's reconnaissance platoon was assigned to identify German positions ahead of the main advance. Standard doctrine called for 2-man teams, 1 spotter, 1 sniper, working together to locate and eliminate high-value targets like machine gun crews and officers. Morrison requested permission to work alone, arguing that a single man was harder to detect than a pair. His platoon leader, Lieutenant James Crawford, approved it reluctantly, noting in his log that Morrison had demonstrated exceptional fieldcraft and situational awareness, though his methods are unorthodox. Morrison's first solo operation into the Hürtgen, a 72-hour reconnaissance mission that started on February 14th, demonstrated both the effectiveness and the horror of his camouflage technique. He left the American lines at 2100 hours, carrying his M1903A4 Springfield rifle, 200 rounds of ammunition, 4 days of rations, and a rubberized poncho. He wore standard army fatigues and boots. No special equipment, no issue camouflage materials. 300 yards into German-held territory, Morrison stopped at a location he'd scouted 2 days earlier, a slight depression in the forest floor with good sight lines toward a German supply trail. This would be his position for the next 3 days. What happened next would have horrified Army medical officers and violated approximately 11 different regulations related to hygiene and proper use of equipment. Morrison began by removing his uniform top and digging into the forest floor with his entrenchment tool. He collected soil, the dark, moist earth from about 6 inches below the surface. Then he collected surface materials, rotted leaves, moss, bark fragments, small twigs. He found animal droppings, likely from deer, and added them to his collection. Then he urinated into his helmet and mixed everything together into a paste that had the consistency of thick mud and smelled like decomposition. He applied this mixture to his face, neck, and hands, in irregular patterns, breaking up the recognizable human shape. Then he did something that would have gotten him court-martialed if any officer had witnessed it. He lay down in the depression he'd prepared, covered himself with the poncho, and then covered the poncho with forest debris. Leaves, branches, moss, everything within reach. He worked slowly, spending nearly 2 hours arranging material so that he became indistinguishable from the forest floor. When he was finished, you could stand 5 feet away and see nothing but forest unless you were specifically looking for him. The science behind what Morrison was doing had a name, though he'd never heard it. Disruptive coloration combined with 3-dimensional texture matching. Human pattern recognition is incredibly sophisticated, evolved over millions of years to detect predators and prey. The brain recognizes human shapes even when they're partially obscured, because certain patterns, bilateral symmetry, specific proportions, regular motion, trigger immediate recognition. Military camouflage attempts to disrupt these patterns using printed designs that break up the body's outline. But printed camouflage, no matter how sophisticated, is still fundamentally 2-dimensional. It creates a pattern on the surface of clothing, but it doesn't change the 3-dimensional shape of the human body underneath. At close range, under certain lighting conditions, the brain can still recognize the human form because the depth cues are still present. Morrison's method eliminated those cues entirely. By covering himself with actual 3-dimensional forest material, he didn't just break up his outline, he eliminated it. The texture of his body matched the texture of the surrounding environment perfectly because it was the same material. The only way to detect him was to literally step on him. The smell was another advantage Morrison had stumbled onto without understanding the biological mechanism. Human scent is distinctive. We emit volatile organic compounds through our skin and breath that animals, and to a lesser extent other humans, can detect even when they can't consciously identify what they're smelling. Covering himself in organic decay masked his human scent with smells that registered as natural to anyone passing nearby. German soldiers moving through the forest would smell rot, earth, and animal waste. Their brains would categorize those smells as environmental and dismiss them, never registering that a human was present. The psychological effect was even more powerful than the physical concealment. German soldiers in the Hürtgen had learned to watch for American positions. They knew what to look for: the outline of a helmet, the shape of a rifle barrel, the pattern of American camouflage materials. Morrison's organic camouflage didn't match any of those patterns. German soldiers would literally look directly at his position and see nothing because their brain was searching for specific visual cues that weren't present. Over the next 72 hours, Morrison eliminated 7 German soldiers. Each shot was taken at ranges between 50 and 80 yards, close enough that missing was almost impossible with his skill level. Each target was selected based on tactical value: 2 radio operators, 3 machine gun crew members, 1 officer, and 1 sniper who'd been causing casualties in Morrison's battalion. After each shot, Morrison remained completely motionless for a minimum of 30 minutes, sometimes longer, while German soldiers searched for his position. They never found him. On February 17th, Morrison returned to American lines after dark, his uniform encrusted with dried mud and organic matter, smelling like something dead. Lieutenant Crawford's first reaction was to order him to the aid station, thinking he'd been wounded. Morrison's response, documented in Crawford's log, was characteristically blunt. "Not wounded, sir, just dirty. Got 7. Confirmed. Request permission for another 72-hour operation starting tomorrow." Crawford approved it, but he also filed a report that worked its way up to battalion headquarters, describing Morrison's results, but also noting concerns about sanitation and proper use of camouflage equipment per field manual standards. That report triggered an investigation that would eventually involve officers who'd never been in combat trying to explain to officers who had why the rulebook mattered more than results. Between February 17th and March 31st, 1945, Morrison conducted 11 separate solo operations into German-held territory, each lasting between 48 and 96 hours. His confirmed kill count reached 143. Every single kill was achieved using the same organic camouflage technique, and every single operation ended with Morrison returning to friendly lines looking and smelling like he'd crawled out of a grave. The other scouts in the reconnaissance platoon started calling him Ghost because German soldiers were reporting being shot by an enemy they couldn't see. Intelligence reports intercepted from German radio traffic mentioned an invisible American sniper operating in the Hürtgen sector. One report, dated March 8th, described Morrison's handiwork in language that suggested genuine fear. Recommend immediate withdrawal from Grid Square 742. Multiple casualties from sniper fire. Origin point cannot be determined. Soldiers report feeling watched but cannot locate source. Morale severely affected. That morale effect was worth discussing because it demonstrated something the U.S. Army hadn't fully appreciated in its sniper doctrine. The primary purpose of a sniper, according to Field Manual 21-75, was to eliminate high-value targets and disrupt enemy operations through precision fire. But Morrison was achieving something beyond that. He was creating genuine psychological terror. German soldiers in his operational area started refusing to move in daylight. They'd huddle in their positions, convinced that stepping into a clearing meant death from an enemy they couldn't fight because they couldn't see him. Captain Robert Heinrich, the reconnaissance company commander, visited Morrison's position on March 12th to observe his technique firsthand. What he witnessed probably violated his understanding of proper military procedure, but it also demonstrated why Morrison's kill count was 3 times higher than any other sniper in the division. Heinrich watched Morrison spend 4 hours preparing his camouflage, collecting materials, mixing them with bodily fluids, applying them in layers that completely transformed his appearance. Then Heinrich watched Morrison settle into position and literally disappear. Heinrich stood 30 feet away with binoculars and couldn't distinguish Morrison from the surrounding terrain. Heinrich's after-action report, filed March 13th, was a masterpiece of military bureaucratic tension. Corporal Morrison's methods are unorthodox and violate established protocols regarding hygiene and equipment use. However, his effectiveness is undeniable. Recommend continued operations with current techniques pending review by division staff. Further recommend examination of existing camouflage doctrine to determine if modifications are warranted based on field results. That last sentence was carefully worded to avoid saying what Heinrich actually believed, that the Army's camouflage doctrine was inadequate for certain operational environments and that Morrison had independently developed a superior alternative. But recommending wholesale changes to doctrine based on one soldier's technique was career suicide unless you had data to back it up. Heinrich needed more than anecdotal evidence. He needed numbers. Between March 13th and March 31st, Heinrich assigned Lieutenant David Foster, the company's intelligence officer, to conduct a comparative study. Foster tracked every sniper operation in the division, distances engaged, conditions, hit rates, and German response times. The data was stark. Morrison, working alone with his organic camouflage, averaged 7.3 kills per operation, with 0 instances of German forces accurately locating his position. Other division snipers, working in standard two-man teams with issue camouflage equipment, averaged 2.1 kills per operation, with German forces locating their positions approximately 40% of the time, usually resulting in mortar or artillery fire that forced withdrawal. Foster's report, completed April 3rd, included a section that must have been painful to write because it essentially admitted that official doctrine was getting people killed. Statistical analysis indicates Corporal Morrison's survival rate and effectiveness significantly exceed division averages. His methods, while unconventional, warrant serious examination, rather than dismissal based on regulatory compliance. But while Foster was compiling data, something else was happening that would complicate the narrative. Other soldiers were trying to replicate Morrison's technique, and some of them were getting sick. Private First Class Raymond Butler from 2nd Battalion tried Morrison's camouflage method after hearing about it from reconnaissance company personnel. Butler spent 48 hours in a forward position covered in organic material he'd collected from the forest floor. He achieved 3 confirmed kills and successfully evaded German detection. He also contracted a skin infection that required medical evacuation and 3 weeks of treatment with sulfur drugs. The infection was caused by bacteria present in the soil and animal waste he'd applied to his skin, which had entered through small cuts and abrasions that are inevitable when you're lying on forest floors. Private Joseph Kramer from 3rd Battalion tried a variation of the technique and developed severe dysentery after inadvertently ingesting contaminated material. Sergeant Michael Torres covered himself in organic camouflage, but failed to properly clean it off afterward, developing a fungal infection in his boots that required his feet to be treated for what medical personnel categorized as trench foot, atypical presentation. By mid-April, the division medical officer, Major Charles Whitmore, had documented 7 cases of illness directly attributable to soldiers using organic camouflage methods. Whitmore filed a report that must have felt like vindication for every officer who'd questioned Morrison's techniques. The use of organic materials, particularly animal waste and decomposed vegetation, as camouflage poses significant health risks. Observed cases include bacterial skin infections, parasitic infestations, and gastrointestinal illness. Recommend immediate prohibition of these methods and enforcement of existing camouflage doctrine as specified in field manual standards. This created a command crisis for Colonel James Hawthorne, the 28th Division's assistant commander. On one hand, he had a soldier who'd achieved unprecedented effectiveness using methods that terrified the enemy and saved American lives. On the other hand, he had medical officers documenting that those methods were making other soldiers sick when they tried to replicate them. The question wasn't whether Morrison's technique worked. The question was whether the Army could officially sanction something that required skill and judgment most soldiers didn't possess. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The meeting happened on April 19, 1945, at Division Headquarters in a partially destroyed gasthouse that served as the command post. Present were Colonel Hawthorne, Captain Heinrich, Major Whitmore, Lieutenant Foster, and Corporal Morrison, who'd been pulled from the field specifically for this discussion. Also present was Lieutenant Colonel Ernest Shaw from 7th Army Headquarters, who'd been sent to investigate the reports of unauthorized camouflage techniques resulting in excessive casualties inflicted on enemy forces. Shaw opened the meeting by asking Morrison to explain his methods in detail. Morrison spent 20 minutes describing the technique, material selection, mixture preparation, application process, and tactical employment. He didn't sugarcoat it. He acknowledged it smelled terrible, looked worse, and violated numerous regulations. His justification was simple. It works better than anything else I've tried, and Germans can't shoot what they can't see. Whitmore countered with medical data. 7 documented illness cases, potential for disease transmission, violation of hygiene standards that existed for good reasons. His position was that even if Morrison could use these techniques safely, the average soldier couldn't, and the army couldn't implement doctrine that only worked for exceptional individuals. Heinrich presented Foster's statistical analysis, kill rates, survival rates, operational effectiveness. His argument was that Morrison had independently discovered something valuable and that dismissing it because it didn't fit existing doctrine was short-sighted. Shaw listened to all of it, then asked Morrison a question that cut to the heart of the issue. "Corporal, why haven't you gotten sick like the other men who tried your technique?" Morrison's answer revealed something that none of the officers had considered. "I learned this from my uncle when I was 12, sir. Spent 6 years learning what materials to use, how to apply them, how to clean them off properly. The guys who got sick, they were doing what they thought I was doing, but they didn't know the details. Which plants are safe, which ones carry parasites, how to mix it so it doesn't cause skin, irritation, how to clean it off so you don't get infections. There's technique." Shaw's next question was the critical one. "Could you teach it?" Morrison thought about that for maybe 10 seconds. "Probably not to everyone, sir. It requires patience most people don't have. You're lying motionless for hours while insects crawl on you. You're accepting discomfort as normal. You're thinking like prey that doesn't want to be found rather than a predator looking for a fight. I could teach the physical technique. But the mindset? That's harder." What followed was a compromise that satisfied nobody completely, but acknowledged reality. Shaw issued verbal guidance that became official division policy on April 22nd. Morrison was authorized to continue using his organic camouflage techniques under controlled conditions, with mandatory medical screening after each operation. Other soldiers were prohibited from attempting similar techniques without direct instruction from Morrison and medical officer approval. The Army would not modify official doctrine based on one soldier's methods, but neither would they prevent that soldier from using techniques that were demonstrably effective. It was the kind of bureaucratic solution that let everyone claim victory while changing nothing about the actual situation. Morrison kept doing exactly what he'd been doing. Other soldiers were officially prohibited from copying him, but unofficially received tips when Morrison returned from operations, and the paperwork was filed in ways that protected careers if anything went wrong. Between April 23rd and June 4th, 1945, Morrison conducted 9 more operations, his confirmed kill count climbing from 143 to 309. Every kill was documented with spotter verification from observers who watched through binoculars from friendly positions, confirming that targets went down and didn't get back up. German radio. Intercepts continued reporting the ghost sniper, with increasing desperation in the language used to describe their inability to counter him. But Morrison's success created unexpected problems beyond the medical concerns. Other snipers in the division were being compared to him, and the comparisons weren't favorable. When a conventional sniper achieved 4 kills in a 72-hour operation using approved doctrine, officers started asking why they weren't achieving 7 or 8 like Morrison. The answer, that Morrison was using techniques that couldn't be widely replicated, didn't satisfy commanders under pressure to maximize casualties inflicted on German forces. Staff Sergeant Paul Delaney, one of the division's most experienced snipers, had a conversation with Morrison on May 3rd that revealed the growing resentment. "You're making the rest of us look bad. Ghost. We're doing everything by the book, and you're out there breaking every rule and tripling our numbers. How's that supposed to make us feel?" Morrison's response, remembered by witnesses, demonstrated both his tactical focus and his complete lack of political awareness. "Feel, however you want, Paul. I'm doing what works. You want to get more kills. Figure out what works better than what you're doing now. The Germans don't care if you followed the manual before they shot you." Delaney's point, though, reflected a real problem with Morrison's approach. Military doctrine exists not just to standardize procedures, but to create baseline capabilities that the average soldier can achieve. Morrison's technique required skills and judgment that weren't teachable in any reasonable time frame. Even if the army had wanted to adopt his methods officially, they couldn't mass-produce the patience, fieldcraft, and cultural knowledge that made it work for him. On May 15th, Lieutenant Colonel Shaw returned to 28th Division headquarters with a proposal that demonstrated the Army's ability to learn even, when it couldn't officially change doctrine. Shaw had been authorized by 7th Army to establish a specialized reconnaissance training program that would incorporate field-developed techniques without explicitly endorsing practices that violated existing regulations. Morrison was to be the primary instructor, teaching selected personnel advanced fieldcraft with emphasis on environmental integration. The bureaucratic genius of this approach was that it created official space for unofficial techniques. Students would learn material selection for enhanced concealment rather than covering yourself in mud and feces. They'd study three-dimensional texture matching instead of breaking every hygiene regulation. The substance was identical, but the language made it palatable to officers who needed plausible deniability if questions were asked. Morrison trained his first class of 8 students between May 16th and May 28th. The curriculum was intensive, 12-hour days spent in the forest learning material selection, application techniques, position selection, and, most critically, the mental discipline required to remain motionless for extended periods while physically uncomfortable. Of the 8 students who started, 5 completed the full course. The other 3 withdrew, acknowledging that they couldn't handle the psychological stress of Morrison's methods. But those 5 graduates represented something significant, proof that Morrison's techniques could be taught to soldiers who had the right temperament. Private First Class James Wu, one of the graduates, conducted his first solo operation on May 31st. Wu spent 60 hours in position using organic camouflage. Morrison had taught him to prepare. He achieved 4 confirmed kills and successfully evaded German detection despite enemy soldiers passing within 10 yards of his position. Wu's success validated Shaw's training program and provided evidence that Morrison's methods weren't just personal quirks, but replicable techniques. The effectiveness of Morrison's approach was becoming statistically undeniable by late May 1945. Foster's updated analysis, completed May 25th, showed that Morrison and his 5 trained students were achieving combined kill rates approximately 2.8 times higher than conventional snipers in the division, while experiencing 0 detection or casualties. The German forces opposing 28th Division had begun relocating units away from sectors where Morrison operated, effectively ceding terrain without being ordered to do so by their high command. Intercepted German communications from May 28th described the situation in language that revealed the psychological impact Morrison had achieved. Recommend withdrawal from current positions due to continued sniper activity that cannot be countered. Personnel report extreme stress from operating in environment where casualties occur without warning or visible enemy presence. Multiple requests for transfer out of sector. This was psychological warfare at its most effective. Morrison wasn't just killing German soldiers, he was making entire units combat ineffective through fear. German commanders were being forced to choose between holding positions and maintaining troop morale, and they were choosing to withdraw rather than watch their soldiers become demoralized by an enemy they couldn't fight. But success created its own complications. By early June, Morrison's reputation had spread through both American and German forces. American commanders wanted him assigned to their sectors. German commanders were offering rewards for information about his location, and Morrison himself was showing signs of the strain that came from spending weeks at a time living like an animal in hostile territory. Captain Heinrich noted in his log on June 2nd that Morrison appeared increasingly withdrawn and uncommunicative when not actively engaged in operations. The technical term would have been combat fatigue, the psychological toll of sustained stress in combat environments. Morrison had spent approximately 80 days of the previous 100 in forward positions, isolated from friendly forces, living in conditions that would break most people within 48 hours. The fact that he was still functional at all was remarkable. The fact that he was still combat effective was almost miraculous. Heinrich recommended Morrison be rotated to rear areas for rest and evaluation. Morrison refused, arguing that German forces in his sector were weakening and that continued pressure would accelerate their collapse. Heinrich pulled rank and ordered Morrison to stand down for at least 72 hours. Morrison complied, but spent those 3 days training another group of 6 students rather than resting. On June 4, 1945, Morrison was killed by German artillery fire that hit his position without warning. The circumstances of his death remain somewhat unclear because there were no American witnesses, and German records from that period are incomplete. What's known is that Morrison had been conducting a reconnaissance mission, observing German positions from approximately 200 yards beyond American lines. German forces fired a barrage of artillery at coordinates that shouldn't have contained any American personnel. Morrison's body was recovered by patrol the following day. The official investigation concluded that German forces had either gotten lucky with their artillery placement or had received intelligence about Morrison's general area of operations. But some officers, including Heinrich, believed Morrison had been betrayed by German civilians who'd been displaced from their homes and forced to work for American forces. The theory was that one of these civilians had overheard discussions about Morrison's operations and passed information to German intelligence. This theory was never proven, but it reflected the reality that Morrison's effectiveness had made him a high-value target worth considerable effort to eliminate. Morrison's death hit the reconnaissance company hard. Soldiers who'd never met him personally knew his reputation. Those who'd worked with him or been trained by him felt his loss acutely. The division held a memorial service on June 7th. Lieutenant Colonel Shaw delivered a eulogy that carefully avoided mentioning the specific techniques that had made Morrison legendary, referring only to his exceptional dedication and innovative approach to reconnaissance operations. Morrison's 309 confirmed kills made him the most effective American sniper in the European theater. The second highest total was 187, achieved by a sniper who'd been operating since D-Day and used conventional techniques. Morrison had achieved his total in less than 4 months, using methods that horrified officers and saved lives. The official record of Morrison's service is, remarkably, sparse. His personnel file lists him as killed in action, June 4, 1945. It notes his marksmanship skills and lists various commendations, including a Silver Star and 2 Bronze Stars. What it doesn't mention is how he achieved those numbers, or why German forces feared him more than entire American battalions. The training program Morrison had started continued after his death. Lieutenant Colonel Shaw expanded it to other divisions, carefully framing it as advanced fieldcraft training rather than explicitly teaching organic camouflage techniques. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, approximately 30 American snipers had completed Morrison's training program. Their combined effectiveness contributed to German decisions to abandon positions in several sectors during the final weeks of the war. But the Army never officially changed its camouflage doctrine. Field Manual 21-75 continued to specify approved materials and methods that had nothing to do with what Morrison had taught. The bureaucratic reasoning was simple. Even if organic camouflage was more effective in certain situations, it couldn't be standardized for mass implementation. The army needed doctrine that worked for the average soldier, not techniques that only exceptional individuals could master. This created a peculiar legacy, where Morrison's methods were simultaneously recognized as effective and officially discouraged. Post-war training materials acknowledged that snipers in certain environments might need to employ locally sourced concealment materials, but stressed that such techniques should only be attempted by highly trained personnel with appropriate medical support. Translation: don't try this unless you're as good as Morrison was, and even then, understand you're taking significant health risks. The Korean War brought renewed interest in Morrison's techniques when American forces found themselves fighting in terrain similar to the Hürtgen forest, dense, mountainous, with limited visibility. Several Korean War veterans later reported that their training included instruction on organic camouflage from officers who'd served in Europe and either learned from Morrison directly or knew people who had. But again, this was never officially documented. The Army's institutional memory was oral, passing from experienced soldiers to new ones, while official doctrine remained unchanged. The real vindication of Morrison's approach came during Vietnam, though even then it was partial and unofficial. Army and Marine snipers operating in jungle terrain found that issue camouflage equipment was inadequate for the dense vegetation and close engagement ranges typical of that conflict. Many independently rediscovered techniques similar to what Morrison had developed, using mud, vegetation, and local materials to break up their outline and blend into the environment. These soldiers reported effectiveness, similar to what Morrison had achieved: higher kill rates, lower detection rates, and significant psychological impact on enemy forces. But Vietnam-era military bureaucracy handled this the same way World War II bureaucracy had, by acknowledging the effectiveness without officially endorsing the methods. Training materials mentioned supplemental concealment techniques and environmental integration, but they never said, cover yourself in mud and stay motionless for days. The liability concerns were too great, even when the tactical benefits were obvious. Morrison's personal effects, recovered after his death and sent to his family in Oklahoma, included the notebook he'd kept throughout his service. The notebook contained sketches of camouflage patterns, notes about material selection, and tactical observations about German behavior. His family donated it to the Fort Benning Infantry Museum in 1968. It sat in their archives for decades, rarely accessed, until a researcher named Dr. Sarah Chen discovered it in 1995 while working on a study of World War II sniping techniques. Chen's analysis of Morrison's notes revealed something that military historians had missed. Morrison had been conducting systematic experimentation with his camouflage techniques, testing different materials and application methods to determine optimal effectiveness. His notes documented temperature conditions, light levels, observation distances, and German response times. It was field research conducted under combat conditions, generating data that would have been valuable for developing improved doctrine if anyone had bothered to analyze it systematically. Chen published her findings in 1997 in an article titled Organic Camouflage and Combat Effectiveness, the Kenneth Morrison Case Study. Her conclusion was that Morrison had independently developed techniques that were theoretically sound based on modern understanding of visual, perception, and pattern recognition, and that his effectiveness was predictable given the principles he was applying. She argued that the Army's failure to formally incorporate his methods into doctrine represented a missed opportunity to improve combat effectiveness across the force. The article generated some discussion in military training circles, but led to no changes in official doctrine. The reasons given were familiar: health concerns, difficulty of standardization, liability issues. The real reason, acknowledged privately by some officers, was that adopting Morrison's techniques would require admitting that official doctrine had been inadequate and that soldiers had been dying unnecessarily. That admission would raise uncomfortable questions about institutional learning and whether the Army prioritized regulatory compliance over combat effectiveness. Modern military camouflage has moved in different directions than Morrison's organic approach. Digital camouflage patterns, adaptive materials, and even experimental systems that can change color based on environment represent technological solutions to the concealment problem. But these high-tech solutions address the same fundamental challenge Morrison faced, making the human form invisible to observers trying to kill you. Morrison's low-tech solution worked because it addressed that challenge at a fundamental level by eliminating the human pattern rather than just disrupting it. There's a memorial to Morrison in Broken Bow, Oklahoma, erected by the Choctaw Nation in 2003. The plaque describes him as a decorated veteran who served with distinction in World War II. It doesn't mention the $309 confirmed kills or the camouflage techniques that made him legendary. Most people who pass the memorial have no idea what Morrison actually did or why his story matters. But among military snipers, Morrison's name carries weight. Stories about the ghost sniper who the Germans couldn't see get passed around in training courses and deployment briefings, usually stripped of specific technical details but retaining the core lesson, that innovation sometimes requires breaking rules, and that the best camouflage isn't always the one approved by headquarters. Joseph Hawkins, Morrison's uncle who taught him traditional hunting methods, lived until 1976. In an oral history interview conducted in 1974, Hawkins was asked if he'd known about his nephew's military service. His answer revealed something about the cultural transmission of knowledge that military institutions struggled to replicate. Kenny learned what I taught him, same as my grandfather taught me. How to become part of the forest so animals don't know you're there. I didn't know he'd use it in the war until his mother told me after he died. Made sense, though. Germans were just another kind of prey. Kenny knew how to hunt. That pragmatic assessment captured something essential about Morrison's approach. He didn't see camouflage as a military technical problem requiring engineering solutions. He saw it as a hunting problem requiring traditional knowledge about how predators and prey interact. The fact that his prey shot back didn't change the fundamental principle: if they can't see you, they can't kill you. The health concerns that military medical officers raised about Morrison's techniques were legitimate. Covering yourself in organic material containing bacteria, parasites, and fungi does create infection risks. Several soldiers who tried to copy Morrison's methods did get sick, some seriously. But Morrison himself never experienced significant health problems from his camouflage, which suggests that his traditional knowledge included practical hygiene measures that weren't obvious to casual observers. In his notebook, Morrison had written brief notes about cleaning procedures. Wash with soap and hottest water available immediately after return. Check for ticks and leeches. Watch for skin changes over next 48 hours. These weren't detailed medical protocols, but they reflected awareness of infection risks and basic preventive measures. The soldiers who got sick typically hadn't followed similar procedures, either because they didn't know to or because they didn't have access to proper cleaning facilities. This highlighted another challenge with Morrison's techniques. They required not just field application knowledge, but also understanding of the full operational cycle, including decontamination and health monitoring. Teaching that complete package would have required significantly more training time than the Army allocated to sniper courses. It would have required medical support that wasn't available in forward areas. And it would have required accepting infection risks that military medical doctrine considered unacceptable. So the Army's institutional decision to acknowledge Morrison's effectiveness while not officially endorsing his methods was defensible from a policy perspective, even if it was frustrating from a tactical one. They couldn't scale his approach across the entire force. They couldn't accept the health risks for average soldiers, and they couldn't redesign their entire training and support infrastructure around techniques that required exceptional individual capability. But that decision had costs. Every sniper using conventional camouflage who got detected and killed represented a capability lost because doctrine prioritized standardization over effectiveness. Every German position that wasn't eliminated because conventional snipers couldn't get close enough represented friendly casualties that might have been prevented. The Army was making rational institutional decisions that had irrational tactical consequences. Morrison's story illustrates a fundamental tension in military organizations: the conflict between innovation and standardization. Militaries need standardized doctrine to train large numbers of soldiers quickly and ensure baseline competence. But standardized doctrine can suppress innovations that work for exceptional individuals but can't be mass-produced. The challenge is creating institutional space for both, and most military organizations struggle with that balance. The informal networks that spread Morrison's techniques after his death, trained soldiers teaching other soldiers without official authorization, represented one solution. But informal knowledge transmission is fragile. It depends on experienced soldiers remaining in service long enough to teach new ones. It gets lost when experienced personnel separate or when unit rotations break continuity. By the time Vietnam required similar techniques, much of Morrison's specific knowledge had been lost, forcing soldiers to rediscover principles he'd already worked out 20 years earlier. Modern military organizations have gotten somewhat better at capturing and disseminating field innovations through after-action reports, lessons learned databases, and professional military education. But there's still reluctance to officially endorse techniques that deviate significantly from doctrine, even when those techniques are demonstrably effective. The liability concerns, standardization challenges, and institutional conservatism that prevented Morrison's methods from becoming official doctrine in 1945 still exist in various forms today. Kenneth Morrison died at age 20, killed by artillery fire in a forest in Germany, fighting an enemy that feared him more than they feared entire American battalions. His 309 confirmed kills made him the most effective American sniper in the European theater. His organic camouflage techniques represented innovation born from cultural tradition applied to modern warfare. And his story illustrates how military institutions struggle to learn from exceptional individuals when their methods can't be easily standardized. The lesson isn't that armies should abandon doctrine and let everyone improvise. Standardization serves important purposes. But Morrison's story suggests that institutional learning requires creating space for innovation, even when that innovation violates existing rules. It requires distinguishing between techniques that are universally applicable and techniques that work for specific individuals in specific contexts. And it requires accepting that sometimes the best answer to a tactical problem comes from soldiers in the field rather than engineers in laboratories. Morrison never sought recognition for his techniques. He didn't write after-action reports advocating for doctrine changes. He didn't request awards or promotions. He simply did what worked, survived as long as he could, and trained others when ordered to. The fact that his methods saved lives and killed enemies was, from his perspective, sufficient justification. The fact that those methods horrified officers and violated regulations was their problem, not his. There's a certain ruthless pragmatism in that attitude. When you're 300 yards into enemy territory and German soldiers are actively trying to kill you, regulations about approved camouflage materials become abstractions. What matters is whether you can see the enemy before they see you. Morrison understood that at an instinctive level that no amount of training could instill in someone who didn't already possess it. The soldiers Morrison trained, the ones who completed his course and went on to use his techniques in combat, carried his legacy forward. Some of them died in the war, some survived and returned to civilian life. A few stayed in the military and eventually trained other soldiers, passing along knowledge that never appeared in official manuals but proved invaluable in combat. That informal knowledge network kept Morrison's techniques alive long after official records stopped mentioning them. In 2015, 70 years after Morrison's death, the U.S. Army Infantry School at Fort Benning added a brief section to their sniper training curriculum on historical concealment methods. The section mentions Morrison by name and describes his organic camouflage techniques in general terms. It's framed as historical context rather than practical instruction, a way to acknowledge his contributions without officially endorsing methods that still make medical officers nervous. Students are told that Morrison's techniques demonstrated effectiveness in specific operational contexts, but require extensive training and medical support that may not be available in contemporary operations. That carefully worded acknowledgement represents the Army's institutional compromise, recognizing innovation while maintaining doctrinal standards. It's probably the best outcome Morrison could have hoped for given organizational constraints. He's remembered, his techniques are documented, and soldiers who need that knowledge can find it if they look hard enough. But the 309 German soldiers Morrison killed remain the most compelling evidence for his method's effectiveness. Each of those kills represented a tactical advantage that conventional doctrine couldn't provide. Each represented a German soldier who died without ever seeing his killer, and each represented validation of techniques that traditional knowledge had preserved for generations until one soldier applied them to modern warfare with devastating effect. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.